Homosexuality is an abomination according to Leviticus 18:22 and cannot be condoned under any circumstance. End of quote. Now, in response to this assertion, a man named Kent Ashcroft, though this piece has been attributed to many others, but he's the guy who wrote it, wrote a letter to Dr. Laura. And he said, "Dear Dr. Laura, thank you for doing so much to educate people regarding God's law. I have learned a great deal from your show, and I try to share that knowledge with as many people as I can. When someone tries to defend the homosexual lifestyle, for example, I simply remind that person of Leviticus 18:22 that clearly states it is an abomination, end of debate. I do need some advice from you, however, regarding some of the specific laws and how best to follow them. When I burn a bull on the altar as a sacrifice, I know it creates a pleasing odor for the Lord. The problem is my neighbors. They claim the odor is not pleasing to them. Should I smite them? I would like to sell my daughter into slavery, as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. In this day and age, what do you think would be a good price for her? I know I'm not allowed to contact a woman while she's in her period of menstrual uncleanliness, Leviticus 15. The problem is, how do I tell? I've tried asking, but most women take offense. Leviticus 25:44 states that I may indeed possess slaves, both male and female, provided they are purchased from neighboring states. A friend of mine claims that applies to Mexicans but not Canadians. Can you clarify why can't I own Canadians? I have a neighbor who insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 clearly states he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself? A friend of mine feels that even eating shellfish is an abomination. Leviticus 11, it is lesser abomination than homosexuality. I don't agree. Can you settle this? Leviticus 21:20 states that I may not approach the altar of God if I have a defect in my sight. I have to admit, I wear reading glasses. Does my vision have to be 20/20, or is there some wiggle room here? Most of my male friends get their hair trimmed, including the hair around their temples, even though this is expressly forbidden by Leviticus 19. How should they die? I know from Leviticus 11 that touching the skin of a dead pig makes me unclean, but may I still play football if I wear gloves? My uncle has a farm. He violates Leviticus 19 by planting two different crops in the same field, as does his wife by wearing garments made of two different kinds of thread. He also tends to curse and blaspheme a lot. Is it really necessary that we go to all the trouble of getting the whole town together to stone them? Couldn't we just burn them to death at a private family affair like we do with people who sleep with their in-laws? I know you have studied these things extensively, so I'm confident you can help. Thank you for reminding us that God's word is eternal and unchanging. We pick and choose. Whenever someone says, in an effort to prove the point, the Bible says, my advice is run. So my point is that since we construct or have had constructed things handed to us, it is our responsibility to deconstruct. And deconstruction in its simplest form is simply asking why questions about why things came to be the way they are. We also said that if Jesus were with us today, what he would likely say to us is, let's go get Mexican. And I'm forever indebted to Rob Negrin, who is here today. Rob, hold up your hand. Where is he back there? Rob Negrin for this line. Thank you. And last week he sent me a piece of music to back it up. This is a brilliant line, by the way. Because Jesus didn't teach about what to believe. Rather, he taught about what to do. And what Jesus did was to have table fellowship with all sorts and conditions of people. So if we ask him what to believe, he would likely say, why don't you come over for dinner and bring your friends, and I'll introduce you to some of mine. Now that got him in all sorts of trouble. The reason the what to believe question would not compute with Jesus is that he was a Jew. This comes as a surprise to so many people. Jews are not big on beliefs. They emphasize laws. So some clever ones among them said, you know, since this Jesus fellow is always breaking the law of some kind, especially about eating, and especially about associating with the wrong kind of people, we can trip this guy up by asking him, okay, what's the most important law? And this gets us into the next leg of our journey into the sacred stream. At least twice a day, every Jew would pray or recite a prayer known as the Shema. It's known that because the first Hebrew word in the prayer is Shema, which is a command, which means hear or listen. And it goes like this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That's the Shema. That would be recited by a Jew at the beginning and the end of a day and all throughout the day. The first letter of Shema is often written onto a piece of metal or a piece of wood and put on the doorpost. I have one on the door of my study that came from Israel and wood, and Jews would touch it going in and coming out of the house. Shema, here. That's the law. The passage goes on to say, keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home, when you are away, when you lie down, when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. So the way that Eugene Peterson translates the Shema is like this. Love God, your God, with your whole heart. Love God with all that's in you. Love God with all you've got. Now, Jesus would probably have been okay if he had left it at that. I don't know, because he kept on breaking laws. And besides, this is nothing that a good, faithful Jew didn't already know and would not already agree with. So when they said to him, what's a great law? And he said this, they said, well, that's right. But he added, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Or again, to paraphrase Peterson's version, these two commands are pegs Everything hangs on them. But some smart aleck in the crowd said, "Who is my neighbor?" Now, if Jesus had been like me, and he was not, and I am not like him, he would have probably said, "Your neighbor is the person who lives next door to you, dummy. The person who is your neighbor is the person who listens to the same news source you get. The person is the person who supports the same political party you do. Your neighbor is the person who supports the same team that you support. You stupid or something?" But Jesus didn't do that. In one version, this is in two places in the narrative, after saying this, Jesus went on to ream out the people who had asked him that question in long discourse that just nailed them to the wall. And they immediately after that sought ways to execute him. Okay? In another version of the narrative that we have where Jesus said this, he told a story about the so-called Good Samaritan. It would be like his telling the story in Israel today of the good Hamas member, or the good IFD force member in Palestine, the Israel Defense member. So the people heard it and they were incensed. Now, the point in realizing this is that in picking up and trying to embrace what Jesus is teaching is dangerous, life-threatening stuff. And when I am talking about life-threatening, I am not talking about somebody walking in the door with an AK-47, although in this culture, you begin to wonder. I'm trying to talk about what Jesus elsewhere meant in his teaching when he said, in order to have life, you've got to be willing to let it go. Now, the relevance of that teaching becomes clear immedately in our reflexive response, thinking, that doesn't apply to me. Or we think, I know some people it should apply to. But he was serious. What does it mean to give up life? Now, before continuing, I have a confession to make. Actually, I have many I should make, but this is the one I'm willing to make publicly at the time. And it's the reason I began with the story I did today about the priest. I have fallen in love. I have fallen in love, and yes, Sherry knows about this, with this man, John Caputo. In the summary that goes out with this class, there will be a link to a Wikipedia article about this man, John Caputo, also known as Jack Caputo. He has written over 23 books. He is a philosopher teaching now at Villanova. He's emeritus at Syracuse. The first book I read of his was a book recommended to me by Matt Russell back during the COVID shutdown called Hope Against Hope. It is an absolutely brilliant work. Then, while reading the book that I have referred to in so many times in here that if I do it again, you'll throw something at me, The Death of the Mythic God, Jim Marion mentioned Caputo again, and so I got and read his book, What to Believe. And then I devoured his book, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And now I am reading his book on religion. By the way, this is not the order in which these books were written. The Hope Against Hope is the one that was written most recently of the books that I have mentioned. And no, I don't expect you to read these. Though if you did, your religious spiritual life would be profoundly deepened. They are not romance novels, so you will have to put your thinking cap on if you're going to read them. But they are worth it. Now, here's some interesting things about this guy that I feel so much resonance with. And we're going to talk about this next week, about does all of this do any good, this title of what I want to do next week. Caputo started out his life as a Roman Catholic. And this is how the book, What to Believe, begins. Now stay with me here. He says, I cannot remember anything older than God, meaning in his life. I cannot remember anything in childhood that happened without God. I cannot remember anything older than being Catholic. I cannot remember God without Latin, or Latin without God. Latin, the sacred language, the one spoken to God and by God, or so I thought. And he goes on at length talking about his Catholic background and upbringing. And I'm going to quote him again now. And I just want to say that what he says about being Roman Catholic, I can say with equal truth and fervency about being raised Southern Baptist. I don't know if you were raised in a religious context, but you may resonate with this as well. This is quoting Caputo. I bring all this up so that you will understand my beginning, my point of departure, from which I started and departed, as in, I beg to take my leave. Because religion is making itself increasingly unbelievable, radical theology seeks out what is believable, which makes for a religion without religion, a religion that is not the one you might be expecting. He goes on to say in this introduction, radical means rethought, restaged, reimagined, reinvented, all in our effort to get at what is really going on. I love this guy. I love his mind. I love the way he thinks. I resonate so deeply with what he says. And that resonance, by the way, again, we'll talk about this next Sunday, is a key to finding truth in spirituality for you. One of my goals in teaching ordinary life is to unearth in our tradition what we can believe in. Now that should go on, in my opinion, in every religion. As Caputo himself says, radicals are traditionalists, and traditionalists have to be radicals if they want to take the process of transmission seriously instead of using it as an alibi to hang on to the past. That's just glorious writing. Now, here's an interesting thing. And this is true in every major religion, whether it is Roman Catholic, whether it is Islam, with Sufism, whether it is in Buddhism, whether it's in Zen. And my app just died, so we won't have slides. That's okay. In the organized religious form of Christianity, that form of organized religion called Catholicism, not Roman Catholic, but we get to that, but Catholicism, that tradition is the tradition that has kept the mystical, the non-dual, alive. It was a Catholic, Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who said, "The Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist." So if you are wondering if you are a Christian or not, you might check your mysticism gauge. Because 40 years after Rahner's death, the will not exist part seems to be coming true about Christians faster than we expected. The fact is, however, that it is a mystical spirituality that is the key to a thriving renewal of everything that matters. So the teachers that I personally currently respect in the tradition I am in all have Roman Catholic backgrounds or Catholic backgrounds. John Caputo, Jim Finley, Richard Rohr, Ilia Delio, James Marion. Joan Chittister, Daramuda Muraku, Michael Morewood, on and on and on. The man who is known as Meister Eckhart, his given name was Eckhart von Hochheim, was a Catholic before the Reformation split Catholicism for the second time. And Catholicism was split tragically in the 11th century, where a lot of the mystical tradition got shoved off into the Orthodox tradition. And we lost that because it became all about what to believe. But it was that Meister Eckhart who wrote the most beautiful line of non-dual mysticism when he said, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me." That's dualism at its best. He also said in a sermon, and most of what we have of Eckhart's are sermons, he said, "God, rid me of God." Now that's a prayer. Again, reading that doesn't give you a non-dual experience. You're only going to get that by So now we're getting deeper in, further out in the sacred stream, and one of the skills that's going to be required for us is to learn to juggle. So we've got to juggle mysticism, self, tradition, evolution, all at the same time. Keep those balls going. Pay attention to them. Especially now that we've gotten to this point in the sacred stream of asking the Jesus question. Our question, because we are inherently dualistic, is, okay, what do I have to believe? And Jesus sidesteps that. He doesn't answer. He says, come eat with me. And so we go and we see who's gathered at the table, and this is intolerable. You want me to do what? So just tell me what's really important. And Jesus does. He says, love God with all you are and love your neighbor as yourself. Period. Now we're going to spend the rest of our lives working those two lines out, which I see as hopeful, exciting. The questions are, what does it mean to love God? Who is it that's doing this loving? And who is our neighbor, and what exactly does it mean to love that person? We need new ways to think about these questions, and paradoxical as it sounds, we need a way of thinking that gets us out of the way we have been thinking. A way of thinking that makes room for wisdom and wonder. Now, the fact is that we, or someone, and I'm not looking for blame, has removed truth from the religions of our time. My current belief is that the truth that is trying to become true in religion is the passionate search for the things we care most about. This goes back to Augustine. Our hearts are restless until we find rest in thee. What are our hearts restless for in this most mysterious world? What does it really mean to love God? Which is a word we use for the mystery that we don't know anything about. So what is this mystery, and what does it mean to love this mystery? You know, I hope that all of this is not just a mid-morning Sunday teaching forgotten by 2 o'clock. What does it mean to love God? You know, if two people are together and they've been for a while, or perhaps they're thinking about getting married, perhaps they have been married, doesn't matter, but they're together, headed in that direction, and one asks the other, do you love me? And the answer is, much of the time, under certain circumstances. You know that relationship is not going for a good future. What does it mean to love God? Well, you know, I'm going to... Now, I want to be clear. God is more important than any religion. I've always loved the Buddhist way of explaining the value of God. They call it Buddha mind, Buddha nature, not they use the word God. But they refer to it as the raft that gets you across the river, or God is the raft on the ocean. I mean, the raft is not the ocean. God is a human construct. Religions are human constructs. It's the mystery beneath them that is not capable of deconstruction. And that is that to which I am trying to speak. I am trying to speak of that which cannot be spoken about. And it's the same when I raise the question, what does it mean to love God? Well, one answer that is headed in the right direction, if we listen to Jesus, one answer is not a formula to recite. It is not a belief to embrace. It is something we do. Jesus was in the prophetic tradition of Judaism. And for the Jewish prophets, the most important name for God was justice. I've heard Richard Rohr say on numerous occasions, there is no quicker way to turn off a group of Christians than to talk about justice. And it's true. None of us want to hear or face into the fact that we are part of an incredibly unjust system. But we are. Those Jews at the time of Jesus who had experienced transformation because of him and his teaching, they eventually got kicked out of their places of worship. And in response, some of them put together what we now know as the Gospel of John. It is the most metaphorical, the most parabolic of all the teachings that we have in what we consider the Christian scripture. There are others that didn't make it, but I think are more valuable. But that's another point of view. One of the most beautiful parables told in the Gospel of John is not a parable told by Jesus, but it's one told by the people who loved him. And it's about the trial and crucifixion. And it's about a guy in the trial and crucifixion drama whose name is Peter. Peter is the one about whom Jesus said, I'm going to build what I'm doing on you. His name was Cephas, and Jesus changed his name. Peter, the rock. So, here's the parable. In the parable, they come in to get Jesus in the garden, and they take him off to be tried. And Peter follows, tries to hang out, tries to stay close. In the place of the trial, somebody says, are you one of his disciples? And Peter says, not me, nope. Elsewhere, as he's exiting that, somebody says, aren't you with that Jesus guy? And says, no, I never met him, don't know him, no thank you. So later, while he's at trial and they're getting him ready to go for execution, he's standing with some of the people in the courtyard warming himself over a fire. And this little girl comes up, maiden girl comes up and says, weren't you with Jesus? He said, no, don't know the man. Church is built on him. Okay? So after resurrection, Jesus and Peter have a talk. I would not have wanted to be Peter in that talk. But there they are, face to face. It's a parable, okay? This is a parable. There they are, face to face, and Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, sure, you know I do. Jesus asked Peter that question 3 times. Peter, do you love me? Yes. Do you love me? Yes. 3rd time, Peter is miffed. He got his feelings hurt, which I always think that's pretty ironic. Here he denied Jesus 3 times while Jesus is being crucified. And here in this casual conversation, Jesus asked him 3 times, in light of that, do you love me? 3 times, and Peter gets irritated? Really? At any rate, after each time Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes. You know that I do. Jesus says, feed my sheep. That is to say, care about what I care about. Well, what does Jesus care about? Come eat with me, sit at my table, meet my friends, bring your own. That's it. Now, the stories of our tradition, like that one, are meant to be read existentially, not literally. That is to say, we are meant to read ourselves into the characters in this story. So let's pretend that we are Peter in the courtyard. We are Peter standing outside where Jesus is with Pilate. We are Peter warming ourselves by the fire. When the young servant girl asks, are you one of his? And we say, no. And we say no because we are more interested in saving our skins than in loving God. Not trying to make you feel bad. It's just the way we are. That's why we have confession every Sunday. At that 3rd denial, it is said that 2 things happened. The cock crowed, as Jesus predicted it would. And this is a parable. Cock crowing means what it's meant since we had roosters. It means wake up. The cock crows. And Jesus looks at Peter. Jesus is leaving Pilate. Peter has denied Jesus. The cock crows. Jesus looks at Peter, and Peter has to decide. What did he see in the eyes of Jesus looking at him in that moment? I believe that what Peter saw in that gaze was Jesus saying, Peter, I love you still. And then, in light of a whole new way of looking at things, Jesus asked, do you love me? What does it mean to love God? No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this, you carry precious cargo, so watch your step, and we'll pick it up here next Sunday. Thank you. Happy Father's Day.